They say anesthesia lingers in your bones longer than it does in your blood. I say clarity often arrives when you're least prepared for it, like 5 minutes after waking from surgery, with a catheter in your side and an IV drip working harder than your family ever has. The ceiling above me was sterile white, its tiles forming a checkerboard that looked suspiciously like the one in my foyer, except less historic and far more fluorescent. I was alive. That much was clear. The pain just below my ribcage told me the surgery had happened. Gallbladder, gone. Family loyalty, also gone, as I was about to find out. My first conscious breath came with the scent of alcohol swabs and lemon-scented betrayal. Then came the voices. Muffled at first. A hallway conversation floating through a cracked hospital door like a rumor looking for a place to land. Already have offers, a woman's voice said. Smooth, breezy, too pleased with herself to notice the volume of her treachery. Soraya. I hadn't even opened my eyes yet, but I'd recognize my daughter-in-law's affected casualness anywhere. I once told her she sounded like an influencer pretending to be relatable. She'd thanked me as if it were a compliment. Then came Jeremy, my son, biologically speaking. I told you it'd move fast. The porch alone is worth a bidding war, he said. Porch? I lay perfectly still, heart climbing. There are few porches in New Haven with ocean view ironwork, original columns, and Federalist charm, and only one of them belonged to the late Harold Prescott and his inconveniently still-living wife. My porch, my house, my husband's legacy. The one thing he made me swear I'd never let fall into the wrong hands. And the one thing I thought was safe from modern greed because it required more than a Zillow login to sell. I opened one eye slowly. The door was ajar. I could see shadows on the floor, a flicker of Soraya's impractical designer heels, Jeremy's loafers, the expensive ones he usually reserved for serious meetings, which apparently included fencing stolen real estate from an unconscious woman. But do you think she'll fight it? Soraya asked. I mean, once she's fully lucid? Jeremy scoffed. She won't remember what day it is. They said anesthesia messes with memory, especially at her age. Ah, there it was. At her age. I'd waited 76 years to be dismissed with such efficiency. It stung. Less because of the words, and more because of the source. I gave that boy life. He was now planning to give away my porch. I just want it handled before she asks questions, Soraya said. We'll say it was for her care, emotional stress, post-op complications, whatever sounds medical. The door clicked shut. Silence returned. I stared at the ceiling, willing my hands not to shake, not from fear, but from fury so sharp it could slice through bed linen. The pain in my side was nothing compared to the weight now sitting on my chest. It wasn't just the sale. It was the assumption that I'd stay quiet, stay sedated, stay old. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I blinked slowly, as if adjusting to the light, and pressed the nurse call button with the composure of a woman ordering tea at a country club. A few seconds later, a nurse appeared. Young, chipper, unaware she'd just entered the opening scene of a legal thriller. Good morning, Mrs. Prescott, she said brightly. How are we feeling? Somewhere between mildly drugged and moderately homicidal, I said. But otherwise, lovely. She blinked, unsure whether to laugh. I saved her the trouble by smiling faintly. I'd like to review my chart, please, and if you could send someone from social work, I have a few questions about post-op decision-making rights. Just academic curiosity, of course. Of course, she echoed, already scribbling a note. As she left, I reached for the small notebook I kept in my purse, which Soraya hadn't thought to remove. Good, her oversight. I began writing. Date, Thursday, 9:48 a.m. Status, alive, alert, legally underestimated. Overheard, son and daughter-in-law discussing house sale. Next step, retrieve deed, review clauses. And then I wrote one more line, not for evidence but for myself. They listed my house while I was unconscious. I'm going to make them wish I'd stayed asleep. I spent the next hour pretending to be groggier than I was, which, for the record, is much harder than it sounds. Slurred speech I could manage. A slow blink, sure, But it takes real discipline to let people speak freely in your presence while giving them the gift of believing you're too doped up to understand their sins. It's the closest I've come to method acting. Harold would have hated it. He thought dishonesty was the refuge of bad lawyers and second-rate husbands. And yet, it was Harold who'd taught me the value of keeping a clause in your back pocket for emergencies. A knock, and then the curtain shifted. Enter Delilah, my day nurse. Early 30s, good posture, and the expression of someone who's read one too many self-help books but still retained a soul. She smiled with genuine warmth. "Morning, Mrs. Prescott. Did we get some rest?" "Like the dead," I said, voice scratchy but even. "Though I hear they tend to get left out of real estate decisions." She paused at that. Just a flicker. The kind of stillness that happens when a nurse hears something too sharp for a sedated patient to say. "Your vitals look good," she said carefully, glancing at the monitor instead of my face. "We'll be getting you up and moving today." "Excellent. I'd hate to miss the open house." That got her. She looked at me properly then, not like I was a fall risk, but like I might be more awake than protocol would like. Delilah tucked her pen into her pocket. "There was some paperwork brought in yesterday. Your daughter-in-law's been helping coordinate things while you were recovering." "Has she?" I murmured. "Soraya's always been so proactive when it comes to other people's assets." She mentioned something about taking care of the house situation. Delilah's voice held a shade of skepticism I liked. Didn't know if that meant maintenance or something more official. I smiled faintly. "She's probably making sure the ghosts get good lighting for the walkthrough photos. It is a historic home after all." Delilah gave a non-committal hum and busied herself adjusting my IV. As she worked, I closed my eyes, not in rest, but to scan the filing cabinet in my mind. Section: Real Estate, Subfolder, Deed, Subfolder, The Clause. It came back in pieces. Harold, 3 years into retirement, obsessing over worst-case scenarios. What if you get dementia and your next of kin tries to flip the place for cash? "Then put something in writing," I'd said. "But for God's sake, make it airtight." He had. Of course he had. The house had been moved into a joint trust, one that listed both our names but held a preservation clause that limited any sale unless 2 very specific conditions were met. 1. I signed over interest in person in a notarized setting. 2. The designated successor trustee, my sister-in-law Celestine, also approved the transfer. I was the resident but not the sole owner. The title was frozen by law unless I thought it with deliberate action. A safety valve, a protection against exactly the kind of betrayal currently brewing 3 doors down in the hospital waiting room. I opened my eyes again. "Delilah?" "Yes?" "Would you mind checking if any legal documents were filed or scanned into my patient chart? POA, real estate forms, financial releases. Just curious what's floating around." Delilah hesitated, then nodded. "I'll check with records." I watched her go, then reached again for the notebook I'd stashed under the blanket. Note to self: confirm clause language with Celestine. Contact trust attorney, Bennett and Leong. Request a printed copy of hospital visitor log. Smile more. It unsettles them. I was awake now, fully. They thought they could list my house while I was full of sedatives and saline. But they'd forgotten the most important clause in any agreement, me. The thing about being underestimated is that it buys you time. Time to plan, time to listen. Time to let the arrogant do what they always do. Overplay their hand. I'd barely finished my lukewarm broth when the door opened like it belonged to her. Soraya. Her heels clicked against the tile like she was arriving at a gallery opening instead of a hospital room. The smile on her face was bright, expensive, and 3 degrees too confident. "Imelda," she said, voice honeyed and falsely cheerful. "You're looking so much better today." I gave her a slow blink and a weak smile. "Oh, you know me. Too stubborn to die, too polite to say it." She laughed a little too hard, then crossed the room and perched on the edge of the chair like someone about to deliver excellent news, or a mild sedative. "I've brought some good news," she said, setting her bag down with theatrical care. We've accepted a full-price offer on the house. I blinked again, this time slower. Have we? I murmured. She beamed. Yes, isn't that wonderful? The market's crazy right now, and Jeremy and I wanted to act while the timing was right. Everything's moving so smoothly. I nodded slowly, the picture of post-anesthesia disorientation. How efficient of you, and here I thought I'd been unconscious all week. Oh, she said lightly, waving a manicured hand. Don't worry. We took care of everything. You'd already signed the paperwork before the surgery, remember? A long pause. No, I said, drawing out the word like I was searching for it in a fog. I must have forgotten. That was all the encouragement she needed. Predators don't wait for certainty. They wait for weakness that sounds like consent. Soraya reached into her designer tote and pulled out a manila folder with a flourish. Here, she said, flipping it open and sliding a sheet across the tray table like she was handing over a brunch menu. This is the power of attorney form you signed. Gave Jeremy full authority to handle everything while you recovered. I stared at the paper, neatly printed, notarized, tidy, the kind of document that looks legitimate to anyone who hasn't taught first-year contract law for 32 years. My name was there, sort of. The signature at the bottom bore a passing resemblance to mine, if I'd signed it during an earthquake, or in a moving car, or possibly with my left foot. I studied it without speaking, just long enough for Soraya to get nervous. You were very clear, she added quickly. You said you didn't want to deal with the hassle and you trusted Jeremy. It was all very straightforward. Of course, I murmured. It's all coming back to me now. I remember thinking, what a wonderful idea. Let's just hand over my life's work like it's a casserole dish at a church potluck. Soraya's smile twitched. I know it's a lot to process, she said, regaining composure. But everything's already in motion. We just need to finalize the closing once the buyer clears their financing. How exciting, I said flatly. And this buyer, do they know the house is held in a preservation trust? That landed like a marble on glass. Soraya blinked. I'm sorry? The deed, I said, tapping the paper with one finger. I assume Jeremy explained to them that the house is encumbered by a dual trust structure, with a sale restriction clause and a successor trustee who isn't currently sedated. Her face did something remarkable, a twitch, a stall, a moment of visible buffering. Jeremy said the title was clean, she said too quickly. I'm sure he did, and I'm sure that'll be a fascinating detail for the courts to untangle. I slid the paper back across the tray with 2 fingers, careful not to smudge it. Evidence, after all, should remain pristine. Well, she said, voice tightening, I'll just leave that with you. We can talk more once you're feeling fully yourself. I smiled, slow and small and surgical. Darling, I've never felt more myself. She gathered her things in a flurry of designer perfume and flustered silence and left the room. I turned back to the window where the winter sun was low over the trees. My hands didn't shake. My voice hadn't wavered. The trap had been set and the bait had taken itself. They forged my name. They forgot my past. They forgot that the worst thing you can do to a woman who built her life on fine print is ignore the fine print. It's funny what the mind does with betrayal. Sometimes it screams. Other times it whispers, like a voice just outside the room, asking if you're sure you remember it right. But memory is a muscle, and mine still bench presses the truth with impressive form. 2 weeks ago, Jeremy had shown up with a Whole Foods bag and that careful, concerned sun tone that always felt like a performance he rehearsed in the car. I picked these up from a compounding pharmacy, he'd said, handing me a brown bottle with a white label and no pharmacy branding. Just a typed sticker that read NS-2, nerve stabilizer, 1 capsule daily. Just something to take the edge off. Might help with the tremors, the headaches. I hadn't told him about either of those symptoms, but he said it so confidently I'd started to doubt myself. Dr. Myers recommended them for his mom, he added, as if his coworker's mother was now the gold standard in geriatric care. Totally safe, natural blend, helps with memory and cognition. Memory and cognition. That's rich in retrospect. At the time, I'd looked at the bottle, then at Jeremy, standing in my kitchen like he hadn't avoided my calls for the last 3 months, and felt the sting of something I couldn't name yet. I took one anyway, because I trusted him. Or at least I trusted that he didn't know how to poison someone without Googling it first. The capsules were pale blue, gelatin, and tasteless, which, in hindsight, should have been my first clue. Anything claiming to be natural and marketed to seniors usually tastes like regret and turmeric. The symptoms started 3 days later. Subtle at first. I forgot where I put my glasses, twice in one morning. Then I called the cat by my late husband's name, which was both awkward and oddly fitting. But it escalated. I started misplacing words mid-sentence, the kind of slippage that would terrify a woman who made her living explaining contract law with surgical precision. Then came the dizziness. Sudden, disorienting. The world would tilt like a lazy carousel, and I'd have to grip the countertop to stay grounded. Jeremy said it was probably age. Soraya suggested I start journaling to help with recall. Because nothing says elder care like condescension in a Kate Spade blouse. I kept taking the pills. Half out of fear, half out of pride. I didn't want to admit something was wrong. And I certainly didn't want to admit that my son might be the cause of it. But the memory that hit me hardest came not in a hospital bed, but in a memory of dirt. It was the garden path, just before dusk. I'd gone outside to clip some rosemary, still in my slippers, hair pinned up like my mother used to wear it when she was just stepping out for a second. The wind was sharp that evening, the kind that rustles old things loose, leaves, doubts, secrets, and then black. I remember the cold of the stone against my cheek, then voices, rushed, distant, Soraya's. She must have fallen. Jeremy's. I'll call the ambulance. The tone wasn't panic, it was practiced, controlled, like he'd rehearsed the line. I didn't see the pill bottle again after that. Not in the ambulance, not in the hospital intake. It vanished like it had never existed, which legally would be very convenient. But my notebook still sat in my purse, and this time I wrote, symptoms began after NS2 capsules, bottle unmarked, not FDA regulated, disappeared after fainting incident. Jeremy initiated supplement, no doctor verified. Investigate compound contents if possible. I stared at the page. Harold once told me, there are only 2 ways to kill someone without a weapon, with paperwork or with pills. Apparently, Jeremy was an overachiever. There's a certain look people give you when they think you're no longer dangerous. Not hostile, not smug, just gently dismissive, like a purring cat that thinks the mouse won't fight back. I'd seen that look on Jeremy's face. But I hadn't expected to see its opposite. Quiet recognition, from a nurse with a badge clipped to her scrubs, and a heartbeat moving faster than protocol allowed. Delilah came in after lunch. Not the first nurse I'd seen that day, but the only one whose smile didn't come with an undercurrent of pity. How are we feeling today? She asked, checking my vitals with a practiced calm. Oh, just grappling with the subtle thrill of betrayal and blood thinners, I said. That earned a faint smile, but her hands paused just long enough to register. She knew, or suspected, or at the very least wanted to know. She glanced at the monitor, then at me. Would you mind if I asked you a question? Only if you don't mind the answer being articulate. She took that as permission. Has anyone from social work visited you yet? No, I said slowly. Should they have? Her mouth tightened. Not a frown, more like someone biting back the urge to tell the truth too loudly. Your daughter-in-law and son requested a meeting with our patient advocate 2 days ago, she said. They wanted to discuss your cognitive capacity. Ah, there it was. The velvet dagger. I tilted my head. How very thoughtful of them. I always hoped someone would diagnose me with dementia behind my back. Delilah exhaled through her nose. They framed it as concern, said they were noticing confusion, forgetfulness, slurred speech. Funny, I said. I assumed the slurring was from being poisoned, Not from aging like a ripe banana. Delilah's lips twitched, but her eyes stayed sharp. We've had a few cases like this, Mrs. Prescott. Not many, but enough. Cases like what, exactly? She lowered her voice. Elderly patients admitted under unclear circumstances. Family steps in, starts talking about confusion. Then a social worker's looped in. Suddenly there's a recommendation for long-term care, medical power of attorney, financial oversight, and real estate transactions, I assume, I asked. Delilah nodded once. The thing is, she continued, those cases usually involve patients who are confused. You're not. I'm glad someone's noticed. She folded her arms loosely. I don't mean to overstep, but if I were you, I'd request your medical chart today, before someone else edits it. That landed with more weight than her tone let on. You think they're going to change something? I asked. I think, she said carefully, that when people are desperate to establish a narrative, they don't always wait for the truth to catch up. I looked at her then. Really looked. She was young, yes, but not green. There was too much knowing in her gaze. She'd seen the underbelly of family politics and hospital protocol, and she'd stayed just long enough to develop a conscience. You're the first person who's spoken to me like I'm still in charge of my own life, I said. Probably because you still are, she replied. But that window narrows if the wrong paperwork gets signed. I reached for my notebook again, flipping to the next page. To do. Request full medical chart, including patient notes and social worker referrals. Review cognitive assessments, if any were ordered. Confirm PO documentation against hospital records. Note, ask Delilah what she didn't say, because there was something else. I could feel it hovering in the air between us. Delilah, I said, voice lower now, why are you really telling me this? She hesitated. Then, because I saw the way your son looked at the hallway security camera before he asked if your signature was still valid in your state. She paused. That's not how a son talks. That's how a lawyer talks, when he's prepping to erase someone. I let that hang in the air for a moment, then nodded. Thank you. Delilah turned to leave but stopped at the door. And Mrs. Prescott? Yes? When you do take them down, let me know. I'd like to watch. They assumed I'd forget. A reasonable bet given the pills, the collapse, the hospital stay, and, let's be honest, the birthday candles I haven't been able to blow out in a single breath since 2012. But memory doesn't always vanish. Sometimes it just hides. And when it comes back, it doesn't knock. It was the tea that opened the door. Not the hospital kind, which tastes like dust and fluoride, but the memory of the cup Jeremy made for me 2 nights before I landed face first in the rosemary bushes. I'd been in the garden that afternoon, pruning the roses with the kind of focus one usually reserves for tax audits or family visits. Jeremy had called out from the kitchen, saying dinner was ready, a rare event in itself, and a red flag in hindsight. My son only cooked when it involved a microwave or guilt. But there they were, sitting at my table, Jeremy and Soraya, both dressed like they'd just come from a board meeting that somehow took place inside a Nordstrom catalog, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, seasonal greens, and a cup of chamomile tea already waiting at my place. It had a bitter aftertaste, not the kind you mention immediately, because God forbid you look ungrateful, but the kind you quietly notice and file away under strange, but not worth a scene. I assumed Jeremy had oversteeped it, or used tap water, or stirred it with his phone. And then there was the joke, Soraya's specialty. This place is going to make the perfect luxury tomb, she said, running a perfectly manicured finger along the rim of her wine glass. All that mahogany and marble. You'll be the classiest ghost in New Haven. I'd laughed, not because it was funny, but because she was the kind of woman who took silence as an insult and politeness as permission. Now, lying in this hospital bed with no witnesses but a notebook and a nurse who knows too much, that entire evening reassembled itself like a body in a forensic lab. The bitter tea, the strange cheerfulness, the way Jeremy had insisted I eat just a little more, like I was a toddler or a dying swan. and the way Soraya had placed her iPhone camera up, strategically angled on the credenza, supposedly checking the time, but really watching? I closed my eyes and leaned back into the pillow, letting the memory sharpen at the edges. There had been a smell in the dining room, lavender polish and fresh paint. Paint? I opened my eyes. Fresh paint. My hallway hadn't needed painting since 2015, but they'd done it anyway, just to freshen things up. Soraya had said it with the same tone she used for clearing out antique books or suggesting I digitize my photo albums. It wasn't for me, it was for the photos. I reached for my notebook with the kind of speed that surprises people when you're 76 and full of gallbladder stitches. Note to self: dinner 2 nights before collapse. Chamomile tea. Bitter. Check compound interaction with supplements. Hallway painted unnecessarily. Why? Soraya mentioned listing that night. Joked about house being a tomb. iPhone angled toward room. Photos, video, evidence. And then I wrote the real realization. The house was listed before I collapsed. They planned it, not after, before. Which meant I wasn't a tragic medical emergency they'd had to manage. I was the final obstacle on a timeline they'd already set. My stomach turned, not from nausea, but from clarity. The same kind I used to feel when reading the second clause of a contract and realizing the client had buried something in subparagraph C. They'd dressed it up, made dinner, served it with charm and shallow laughter. But the truth sat at that table too. It had smiled, it had poured my tea, and it had waited, politely, for me to collapse. There are few things more comforting than the sight of someone walking into a hospital room with a purpose and a legal pad. Celestine Prescott didn't knock. She never did. She simply entered like every room had been waiting for her, and this one, fluorescent lights, sterile linens, and all, was no exception. Her coat was black cashmere, her heels practical, and her bag heavy in the way only leather and litigation can be. She looked like a woman who'd come from court, or at the very least, had caused one to be postponed. "Imelda," she said, setting her things down with surgical precision. "I got your message." I hadn't sent one, not directly, but Celestine had always had a sixth sense for disaster, and a soft spot for me, disguised as disdain for everyone else. She perched at the edge of the chair, the way only people who do not intend to stay long do. "Tell me what happened," she said. No greeting, no sympathy. Just the request of someone who intended to solve the problem before lunch. So I did. I told her about the forged signature, the pills, the hallway conversation, the dinner with the bitter tea. I told her about the way Jeremy looked at the security camera and the way Soraya smiled like a woman who thought she'd won a prize for patience. Celestine didn't interrupt. She didn't gasp. She took notes. When I finished, she opened her laptop and began typing like she was filing something in the Federal Register. "Let me guess," she said, not looking up. Jeremy presented a POA. Soraya stood behind him like a decorative knife. "Accurate," I said. She clicked a few more times, then turned the screen toward me. There it was, the Prescott Preservation Trust, signed and filed in 2003, drafted by none other than Celestine A. Prescott, Esquire herself. "You remember this?" she asked. I smiled. "I remember calling it overkill. And I remember calling you naive." She clicked again. "This clause, Section 12B, is the trigger. It prevents any sale or transfer of the property unless you, the resident beneficiary, provide notarized in-person consent. Period." I read it aloud, just to feel it in my mouth. "In the event that Imelda Grace Prescott is temporarily incapacitated or unavailable, no legal authority, including power of attorney, may override her residential claim without both her notarized consent and co-trustee verification." I looked up. "That would be you." Celestine raised an eyebrow, and I didn't verify anything because no one asked. A pause passed between us, not silence, assessment. "They forged the signature," I said. "Jeremy must have printed that POA template off LegalZoom and hoped no one would notice." "He's betting you wouldn't remember," she said. He's betting the notary was lazy or imaginary. He's betting your memory loss would cover his paper trail long enough to finalize a sale. He doesn't know the house is in a trust, I added. Oh, he will. Celestine turned the laptop back toward herself. Because the moment they attempt to close escrow, the title company will flag the restriction. And then someone's going to have to explain why a historic property is being transferred without the trustee's sign-off. And that someone, I said, will be Jeremy. Possibly from a holding cell. Celestine smiled, sharp, symmetrical, and deeply satisfying. Imelda, she said, I have filed RICO cases against pharmaceutical executives with less nerve than your son. If they want a war, we'll give them a symposium. Do you think we can stop it in time? Darling, she said, snapping her briefcase closed. We already have. She stood, adjusted her cuffs, and walked to the door, then paused. Oh, and one more thing, she said over her shoulder. Yes. I always hated Soraya, but now I have a legal reason. It's a particular kind of joy, the kind that doesn't show up with streamers or cake, when you realize your dead husband outsmarted your living relatives from beyond the grave. I hadn't smiled in over a week, not a real one, not since the tea. But when Celestine turned her laptop toward me and pointed to a clause tucked near the bottom of the trust agreement, the one I'd skimmed 15 years ago with all the arrogance of someone who didn't think she'd need it, I felt the first real curve of my lips return. I'd forgotten about this, I said, reading it aloud slowly. In the event of temporary or permanent incapacitation of Imelda Grace Prescott, all decision-making authority over the property located at 412 Delafield Lane shall transfer to the stewardship of the Connecticut Historic Preservation Trust. No family member may act as legal proxy or fiduciary on behalf of the resident, regardless of power of attorney claims. Celestine folded her arms. It's what your husband called the I love you, but I know you married into wolves' claws. I stared at the text. No family member, not Jeremy, not Soraya, not a forged signature, not a weak notary, no one. Not only could they not sell the house, they couldn't legally stand on the porch and call it theirs. I told Harold he was being dramatic, I said quietly. Celestine smirked. You told Harold he was preparing for a betrayal that hadn't happened. Well, I said, eyes still on the screen. Apparently he was just preparing early. She nodded. Your husband may have failed at emotional communication, but he was excellent at legal foresight. We sat in silence for a moment, a rare thing between two women who are never short on words. And then I did something I hadn't done since the day I woke up in the hospital with a forged signature and a missing gallbladder. I laughed. Not a bitter laugh. Not the tight, exhausted chuckle of someone surviving in slow motion. It was something warmer, quieter, real. I pressed a hand to my chest. Oh, Harold, I murmured. You paranoid, detail-obsessed man. You actually did it. You protected me. Celestine leaned back in her chair, satisfied. They can't even list the property without triggering a fraud alert. The trust has its own monitoring system, and the preservation board gets pinged the moment an unverified transaction enters public record. That explains the sudden silence, I said. I haven't heard a peep about the closing date. They've likely hit a title snag, Celestine replied, and they're trying to figure out if they can bluff their way around it. I nodded slowly. They can't. No, she said. They absolutely cannot. There was a comfort in knowing that somewhere, right now, Jeremy was probably pacing in a room filled with unanswered emails, and Soraya was frantically Googling what unrecordable deed meant. Do we wait for them to implode? I asked. Or do we help the process along? Celestine raised an eyebrow. Oh, we help, gently, legally, with documents they can't refute and language they don't understand until it's too late. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a letter, the kind of letter that doesn't raise its voice, because it doesn't have to. I've already sent notice to the title company and escrow manager. The house can't be sold, transferred, refinanced, or remodeled without your notarized consent, which you did not and could not give. And the fake POA? Being reviewed for criminal fraud as we speak. I leaned back into the pillows. The fourth beeped softly in the background like a metronome keeping time for justice. I hadn't won. Not yet. But for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like the one being outmaneuvered. They thought I was sleeping. They thought I was weak. They thought I didn't read the fine print. But Harold did, and Celestine made sure of it. And now, I was awake. There's something deliciously absurd about watching people commit fraud in broad daylight. In pearls, no less. According to Celestine, Soraya had gone full suburban realtor. She'd hosted a private walkthrough of my home, the house I was still legally living in, for what she called a discreet buyer with vision. Vision, I assumed, for gutting the 1796 crown molding and replacing it with something called open concept minimalism, otherwise known as character homicide. Apparently, Jeremy had stood beside her like an underqualified sidekick in a house-flipping documentary, tossing out phrases like transitional zoning potential and probate clearance in progress. Probate clearance, as if I were dead, or at least dying on schedule. I was neither. But their timing was, as always, tragically optimistic. Here's what they didn't know. The buyer wasn't just a buyer. He was Nathaniel Rhodes, Celestine's former litigation partner and, more relevantly, an investigator for the Connecticut Real Estate Ethics Council. He'd been looped in the moment Celestine spotted my address on a flagged property transaction report. Because as it turns out, when you try to illegally sell a trust-protected colonial landmark, people notice. Especially people with law degrees and time on their hands. Nathaniel had played along beautifully. He'd shown up to the tour in a camel coat and wire-rimmed glasses, nodding thoughtfully at the ceiling beams and asking loaded questions like, "And the resident? She's moved out permanently?" To which Soraya had said, cheerfully, helpfully, "Oh yes. She's no longer in decision-making condition, medical complications. We're handling everything." Then Jeremy chimed in, smooth as old oil. "The paperwork's all in process. Power of attorney, title transfer, probate clearance should be finalized within the month." Nathaniel, God bless him, had nodded solemnly and jotted it all down, like a man just taking notes and not building a civil case in real time. By the time Celestine showed me the security cam still of the two of them standing in my foyer, Soraya gesturing at the staircase like she'd personally installed it, I could barely contain my smile. "They showed him the entire house," Celestine said, "top to bottom. Even brought out the architectural plans and the Zillow draft." "They're idiots," I said, admiring Soraya's outfit. "Stylish idiots, but idiots nonetheless." Celestine nodded. He asked about the deed. Jeremy said everything was being handled in-house, which I assume means illegally and over email. "And Nathaniel?" "Oh, he was very impressed. Said it reminded him of a federal case from '08. Same energy, same fake signatures." I leaned back into my pillow and let out a long, satisfied breath. "They really thought I wouldn't remember anything," I said. "Not the pills, not the paint, not the tea. They were counting on it. And now? Now they've provided a first-hand account of their intent to commit real estate fraud," Celestine said. "On video, with timestamps, and a witness who has published in the Yale Journal of Legal Ethics." I raised an eyebrow. "Overkill?" She smirked. "Oh, honey, this is the kill." I looked again at the image of Soraya in my hallway. One hand on her hip, the other waving toward the fireplace like it was hers. "She's going to hate this," I said. "Almost as much as I've hated her for the past 9 years, Celestine replied. And for the first time since this all began, I let myself imagine the end. Not with bitterness or rage, that was beneath me, but with satisfaction. They showed a buyer my home, but they didn't realize the house came with a clause, and the clause came with a woman. And the woman? She was finally ready to stop being polite. There's a certain kind of silence that happens just before someone realizes they're not in control anymore. It's not panic, not yet. It's that little glitch in the face. The one where the polite smile falters and the brain starts scrambling for exit routes. That's the silence I got when Jeremy and Soraya walked into my hospital room and saw Celestine sitting next to me with her laptop open, and me, fully alert, fully awake, and fully done pretending otherwise. Jeremy had brought flowers, peonies, my least favorite. He would have known that if he'd ever listened. "Mom," he said, placing the vase down like we were starting over, "you're looking great." "I am," I said with a slow smile. "It's amazing what clarity can do for one's complexion." Soraya sat on the edge of the chair and crossed her legs. That classic maneuver of women who think they're still running the room. "I'm so glad you're feeling better," she said. "We've all been really worried." "Have you?" I asked softly. "That's so touching, especially considering you were actively trying to erase me with lavender tea and forged paperwork." Jeremy blinked. "Excuse me?" he said. I reached into the drawer beside my bed and pulled out the envelope Celestine had prepared. Inside, the toxicology report, a copy of the forged POA, and a notarized statement from Nurse Delilah, who, as it turns out, has an excellent memory and a low tolerance for financial predators in designer heels. "Let's talk about the supplements," I said, setting the papers down. Jeremy didn't speak. Soraya reached for her handbag like it might contain a reasonable excuse. "3 weeks ago," I continued, "you brought me unmarked pills. You called them nerve stabilizers, said they'd help with clarity, sleep, and blood pressure." "They did help," Jeremy said quickly. "You were complaining about—" "I was sedated," I interrupted, still calm. "Just enough to miss details. Slur speech, misplaced time, it was subtle, almost elegant. You did just enough to make me seem like someone who needed a guardian, not someone being groomed for a signature." Jeremy looked at the floor. Soraya started to say something, but I held up one hand. "I'm not finished." I pulled out my phone and pressed play. The voice that came through the speaker was crisp, familiar, and damning. "The house is just dead weight, all that history, all those dusty books. It's like she's living in a museum no one visits." It was Soraya, 2 days before my collapse. Recorded by the front hall security camera she didn't realize was synced to a cloud drive Herald set up in 2014. I let the words hang in the air for a moment, then pressed stop. "Dead weight," I repeated softly. Interesting choice of words, considering you were actively trying to make sure I became exactly that. "Mom, this is insane," Jeremy said. "We were trying to help you." "Oh, darling," I replied. "If that was help, I'd hate to see what malice looks like." Soraya stood up. "We didn't poison you. That's ridiculous." I met her eyes. "Then why did the pills disappear before the paramedics arrived? Why did you tell the ER I was acting confused the week before? Why did you tell a buyer, a fake buyer, by the way, that I'd already vacated the property permanently?" No answer. Celestine closed her laptop with a satisfying snap. "Here's what's going to happen," I said. "You're going to leave. Now you're going to refrain from contacting title companies, realtors, or fictitious notaries. And then you're going to wait for the consequences." Jeremy opened his mouth again. "I wouldn't," I said, "because the next thing I say will be under oath." They left, finally, in a rustle of expensive guilt and a perfume I would forever associate with incompetence. As the door clicked shut, I turned to Celestine. "I believe that concludes the soft part of the intervention," I said. She smiled. "Next," she said, "we file." There's something poetic about receiving a cease and desist letter while someone is still hooked to an IV. Celestine arrived just after lunch carrying a slim black folder like it was a courtroom exhibit. Her heels clicked down the hallway like punctuation marks. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. She handed me the folder and I opened it slowly, with the kind of reverence you give to a legal document that smells faintly of ink and vengeance. At the top, Prescott Preservation Trust, legal counsel below it, in neat serif font, "To whom it may concern, any party found to be participating in, facilitating, or attempting the sale, transfer, or listing of the property at 412 Delafield Lane, in violation of the Preservation Trust, will be prosecuted under Connecticut General Statute Section 53A. specifically pertaining to real estate fraud, falsified documentation, and elder coercion. Celestine tapped the edge of the page. That went out to the title company, the listing agent, and the mortgage broker they tried to pre-qualify with Jeremy's financials. I raised an eyebrow. Jeremy tried to get a mortgage? On your home, yes, using an inflated appraisal, a forged POA, and a fictional retirement account. I closed the folder slowly and set it in my lap. I taught contract law for 31 years, I said. And not once did I think I'd live to see someone flunk this badly in real life. That afternoon, at precisely 3:12 p.m., Jeremy and Soraya returned. No flowers this time, just tight smiles, forced apologies, and the palpable tension of two people who'd Googled the statute number and hadn't liked what they found. "Mom," Jeremy began, his voice pinched. "We need to talk about what Celestine sent." "No," I interrupted gently. "You need to listen, and then you need to leave." I picked up the letter and read it aloud, every word. When I reached section 53A, Soraya paled like someone who just realized the difference between a bad idea and a criminal one. "You forged a signature," I said evenly, "on a trust-protected asset." Jeremy opened his mouth. "That's a felony," I added before he could spin it. "And unfortunately for you, intent matters less than outcome when the evidence is so thoroughly documented." "I didn't forge anything," he said weakly. I held up the lab report. "You administered unprescribed medication without disclosure. That's attempted incapacitation." He shifted. "You were confused." "I was drugged," I snapped. "There's a difference." And Nurse Delilah confirmed both dosage and delivery timing. Soraya looked like she might vomit, or cry, or run. Possibly all three. "Listen, we didn't mean—" "You meant to sell my house while I was sedated," I cut in. "You meant to transfer a historic home into your name and flip it before the probate flags hit the system. You meant to erase the part where I'm still breathing." Jeremy reached for the back of a chair, steadying himself. "This was just a misunderstanding," he muttered. Celestine stepped forward. "Oh no, dear. A misunderstanding is forgetting someone's birthday. This was conspiracy and fraud." Soraya tried one more time. "Can't we just reset this?" she asked. "Move forward?" "Of course," I said, smiling. "Right after you speak to the district attorney and the Connecticut Real Estate Commission." They stood there a moment longer, blinking, as if the room might change its mind. It didn't. "I built my life in that house," I said. "Brick by brick, document by document. And you tried to turn it into an ATM." Jeremy's voice cracked. "We didn't think it'd go this far." "It didn't," I said. "It went exactly far enough." They left in silence. No dramatic exits, just two quiet figures walking headfirst into consequences. Celestine leaned against the windowsill, arms folded, victorious. "You were right," I said. "We didn't have to shout." She smiled. "Number, we just had to speak clearly, and in statute." 1 month later, the house is exactly where I left it. Upright, unbothered, and not listed on Zillow. The same cannot be said for Jeremy and Soraya, whose mugshots now exist in both the state records and, thanks to a helpful journalist from the Hartford Courant, the 4th page of Google search results under Elder Abuse, Connecticut. Apparently, being charged with attempted real estate fraud, intentional misuse of power of attorney, and unauthorized medical interference tends to complicate one's holiday plans. I wouldn't know. I've been busy. The morning after their indictment, Celestine brought over croissants and a new laptop. We sat on the back porch, under the same arbor where Jeremy once tried to convince me to declutter the antique nonsense. Now, that antique nonsense includes a desk where I'm co-authoring a new guidebook. Trust me, Legal Self-Defense for the Aging Mind. Subtitle: How to Stay Sharp When They Hope You Won't. It's Celestine's idea, of course. She's been giving seminars on elder protection law for years, but this time, I'll be the one writing the preface. They called it paranoia, I've typed. We called it evidence. The house is quiet again, not lonely, just intentionally selective. The walls hold their history tightly now, as if reminded how quickly someone will try to strip them clean if you aren't watching. Every room has been restored to what Harold and I built it to be, a place for peace, books, decency, and if necessary, legal strategy. The teacups are back in their cabinet, the will is updated, the security system is now smarter than my son ever was. And me? I've never felt sharper. The DA called last Tuesday, asked if I wanted to make a statement during sentencing. I declined. My words have already done what they needed to do. And frankly, I've always preferred written argument over courtroom theatrics. Besides, there's something far more satisfying about watching people realize that the woman they tried to erase is now an author of their downfall. Celestine says I should take a vacation, that I've earned something with a beach and a bar tab. I told her I already live in a historic vacation home, one I own outright, with a layered trust, dual notarization requirement, and a clause that now bears my initials. But I might still go, just for the view. Maybe I'll sit on a coastal patio, sipping something cold, reading about people like me. People they thought were too old to fight, too fragile to notice, too sweet to strike back. And I'll underline the parts that feel familiar, the clauses, the loopholes, the silent betrayals, and I'll remember, not out of bitterness, out of principle. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the greatest mistake anyone can make is confusing calm for weakness. They thought I was too old to notice. Turns out I was